In this lecture, we will focus on the period of the Flavians through the fall of the Roman Empire, that is the period from 69 AD to 476 AD. In 69 AD, the Roman Emperor Nero, also known as one of the two Mad Caesars, died. He died in 69 AD from what we call assisted suicide. You might remember from our last lecture that by 69 AD, the Roman Senate had grown tired of Nero's craziness. They thought of him as an embarrassment, and in 69 AD they ordered him to either commit suicide or they would have him assassinated. So he had attempted to commit suicide, was unable to do it, asked a servant to aid him, who agreed to do so, and in 69 AD, with the words, "The world is losing a great artist," Nero died. He was stabbed to death by his servant. In 69 AD, Nero died without an heir. The reason for this, hopefully you will remember from our last lecture also, was that Nero had the nasty habit of murdering people, including two of his wives and his own mother. The second wife that he murdered was pregnant, 9 months pregnant to be exact, and he kicked her to death in her 9th month of pregnancy. As a result, the baby died as well. So in 69 AD, Nero died without an heir. At that point, 4 men in Rome who thought they should have an opportunity to be emperor just because they were rich and powerful and had their own armies, and because there was no one directly tied to Nero to step in and take his place, these 4 guys began to fight each other for control of the empire. So we call 69 AD the year of the 4 emperors because there are literally 4 emperors in 69 AD. 4 men fight, 4 men briefly control Rome. One of those 4 ends up holding on to Rome long term. That man is Vespasian. Vespasian starts a new dynasty for Rome called the Flavians, who rule Rome from 69 AD to 96 AD. The Flavians include Vespasian, who reigns from 69 to 79, his 2 sons, Titus, who reigned from 79 to 81, and Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96. The Flavians really don't contribute much to Roman history, so we'll look at them just very quickly. We have said before in our discussions of Rome that the Romans loved grotesque, gory, sporting events such as gladiatorial combat. They also enjoyed plays, and in those plays we actually had actors put to death for the enjoyment of the crowd, etc., etc. Well, the Romans had a particular place that they went to in Rome to watch these sorts of spectacular events, and by spectacular I mean that's what they called them, spectacles, but they had no real nice place to go to watch these events. So Vespasian is the man responsible for building the Colosseum in Rome, the Colosseum that we associate as being a ruin today in the heart of Rome itself, was actually built by the Emperor Vespasian. Vespasian had this Colosseum built for the enjoyment of the Roman people. At the same time, he was destroying Judea. And I'll just remind you that we've seen this area where the Jews live change names and hands multiple times. Judea was known as Palestine, then Israel, then Judah. It had come under the control of the Assyrians, the Persians, Alexander the Great, and now the Romans. The Romans really mistreated the Jewish people, taxed them very harshly, tried to force polytheism on them, the worship of many gods, in particular the Olympian gods, which had been adopted from Greece. So Judea was sort of, I guess you could call like a powder keg, ready to explode at any point because of what they saw as Roman mistreatment of them. More about that later. Titus and Domitian really don't contribute much to Roman history either. But if we're going to say anything about either of those two, I'll just briefly tell you that Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96, left to us a book entitled The Care of the Hair, which was about male baldness and possible remedies for it. Unfortunately, he didn't actually find a cure. Domitian was also haunted by the fact that he had visited a psychic and she had predicted the actual date and time of his death, and it became an obsession with him. He was already a nervous type anyway, so seeing this psychic and getting that news really unnerved him, and he talked about it constantly, obsessed about this date. As it drew nearer and nearer, it became more and more of an obsession for him, and ultimately on the date and time which had been predicted, one of Domitian's servants killed him so he didn't have to hear about Domitian's fear of that date and time anymore. When Domitian died, he was succeeded by a family called the Antonines, who ruled from 96 AD to 192 AD. Domitian died without an heir. There was a brief struggle for the throne of Rome. The family who won were called the Antonines. They're more commonly referred to in Roman history as the Five Good Emperors. They ruled Rome from 96 to 192. Why are they called the Five Good Emperors? Well, there were five of them: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Why do we call them the Good Emperors? Well, three main reasons. Stability. Between 96 and 192 AD, the Roman people knew who the next emperor would be, because each one of these men determined who their heir would be before they died, and even worked out a backup plan so that there was never any doubt or any concern or any need for civil war, because each of these guys had an heir and a backup heir already determined before his death. The second reason why we call them the good emperors is because this is the highest standard of living achieved in the Roman Empire. In other words, this is the richest and wealthiest that the Roman Empire would ever be. People in this time period from 96 to 192 actually had money for all the things they needed, as well as things that they wanted, luxury items, for example. So this was the high point of Rome's economy. This was their richest point. A third reason we can say they're good emperors is because they cooperated with, rather than antagonized, the Senate. And we saw examples of that with Caligula and Nero, who seemed to sort of get a kick out of aggravating the Senate. Well, the Antonines took it upon themselves to cooperate with the Senate and actually enjoyed a very good working environment with the Senate. So briefly, I'll mention who these Antonines or Five Good Emperors are. They're Nerva, who reigned from 96 to 98. Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117. Historians agree that the empire was at its largest extent during the reign of Trajan, somewhere approximately about 2 million square miles, and it is Trajan who is the last Roman emperor to add territory to the empire. After Trajan, other emperors will be simply concerned with trying to hold on to what had already been taken in conquest and war. Hadrian is a perfect example of this. Hadrian reigned from 117 to 138. He took a look at the treasury of Rome, realized Rome was doing pretty good, but if they continued to spend money on conquering more territory, they might end up bankrupt. So Hadrian's real claim to fame is that he put his soldiers to work not conquering territory, but building walls and permanent boundaries and barriers all around Roman territory. He did this for a number of reasons: to avoid bankruptcy by continuing to expand. He also did this to keep his soldiers busy, because the whole point of a soldier or legionnaire's life was to conquer territory. If the legionnaire isn't busy, if he's bored, perhaps he would rebel against Hadrian. So Hadrian put his soldiers to work building frontiers, permanent frontiers, walls, barriers, all across the Roman Empire to say this is where Rome stopped, this is what Rome was willing to fight to defend. Anything on the other side was open to whoever was powerful enough to take it. So basically, he did this to keep his soldiers busy, but also to show that this is where Rome was going to stop. When Hadrian died, he was succeeded by Antonius Pius, who reigned from 138 to 161, who was succeeded by Marcus Aurelius, reigned 161 to 180. Marcus Aurelius is known for his brilliance and intelligence. He was referred to in his own lifetime as a philosopher king, the sort that Plato had envisioned in his perfect city-state utopia. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 as a result of foul play. He was suffocated to death by his evil son Commodus, who reigned from 180 to 192. Commodus is not considered to be one of the five good emperors. He brings the reign of the five good emperors to an end. Commodus was inept, corrupt, evil, a little bit weird, had incestual relations with his sister, dreamed of being a professional wrestler, and when he actually went out into the Colosseum in 192 AD to fight in a match as a wrestler, this was too much for the Roman people. He was assassinated on his way into the Colosseum to spare Rome the embarrassment of seeing their emperor act as a wrestler. So when Commodus died in 192, we see very quickly that things are going badly for the Roman Empire. The Antonines, or the five good emperors, the high point of Roman development, was followed by the terrible 3rd century, 200 to 299 AD. In the terrible 3rd century, we have every problem you can imagine for Rome, from flood, famine, invasion by various groups like the Saxons, the Alemanni, the Goths, just to name a few, plague. Most importantly, though, political instability. In this period, known as the terrible 3rd century, there is only one emperor with a lengthy reign. His name is Septimus Severus. He reigns from 193 to 211. His family were called the Severi, and they would follow him as the emperors of Rome until 235. One of the Severi was the Emperor Caracalla, who extended citizenship to all free men. Following the Severi, Rome had 22 rulers in 49 years. These emperors are called the Barracks emperors, and they ruled Rome from 235 to 284. These men were soldiers who used their friendships with other soldiers to propel themselves to the position of emperor. Most of these barracks emperors held power for such a short time, just a couple of months, maybe as long as a year, 2 years at the absolute most. They never had time to make it actually back to Rome and sit on the actual throne of Rome. They're called the barracks emperors because they were soldiers and used their position as soldiers and friendships with others to hold the Roman Empire briefly. So, again, the worst problem in the terrible 3rd century was political instability. A constant change in emperors, a constant change at the top. The terrible 3rd century was followed by the 4th century, 300 to 399. We're just going to briefly mention here in the 4th century a few rulers and their significance. The Emperor Diocletian reigned from 284 to 305. When his reign began, Diocletian ruled from the city of Rome, Rome's traditional capital. But he took a look around the city and realized that Rome wasn't quite as good as it once had been. It was in a state of disrepair, decline, wasn't so nice anymore. So Diocletian made a really remarkable decision. He decided to leave Rome, set up shop on an old Greek city called Byzantium in Turkey, and he moves there and oversees the Roman Empire, not from its traditional capital at Rome, but from the ruins of this old Greek city in Turkey. He also made a decision at that point that he needed some help ruling the Roman Empire. It's so huge at this point, 2 million square miles from Great Britain all the way over to Jordan, that he just couldn't do it by himself. Now, this may sound familiar. Octavian had used Mark Antony in a similar way, but Diocletian goes a step farther here, and he actually officially divides the Roman Empire into two halves. The Roman Empire is divided right down the middle into a Western or European part, which was the traditional center of the Roman Empire from the city of Rome, and an eastern half. Diocletian, who was the Roman emperor, is now going to rule from the eastern half. In the western part, he appoints as his helper a man named Maximian. From 284 to 305, Diocletian and Maximian co-rule. The empire was officially divided, and this is an important date, in 293. For the rest of Rome's history, from 293 until its collapse in 476 AD, the Roman Empire is divided into two halves. And this really does spell the end of Rome, because what we see starting to happen with Diocletian is all the money, all the wealth that was used to protect and to make Rome a better city, to keep it going, all of that money, all of those resources now go to the eastern half of the empire. So the eastern half grows, prospers, gets bigger, better, and more stable at the expense of the west. So in 293, the Roman Empire has western and eastern halves. The eastern becomes more important. In the 4th century, we also have the reign of an emperor named Constantine, who reigned from 305 to 337. Constantine is significant for a number of reasons, and we'll go through these quickly. First of all, Constantine now is not ruling from Rome. He rules from this area in Turkey called Byzantium, this old Greek city. He wanted to make this city beautiful like Rome used to be. So he changes the name of this city from Byzantium to Constantinople, of course named after himself. Constantinople in Turkey, which is the eastern half of the Roman Empire, becomes the official capital in 330. Constantine is also called the first Christian emperor, and he converts to Christianity after he has victory in a war against some of his enemies. Long story short, Constantine went into battle against 3 men who were all claiming to have control of the Roman Empire. And as Constantine was going into battle, he heard the booming voice of the Christian God, Yahweh, who said to him, "In this sign you will conquer." And Constantine said that when he looked into the sky, he saw a cross. So he made a bargain with God, and he said, "No, I'm not going to convert before the battle like you're suggesting, but if I win this battle, I'll convert to Christianity." So historians have debated this story for generations, and basically what they've come to the conclusion is that Constantine recognized that the Christians who had been so persecuted by the Emperor Nero had grown huge in numbers by this point. Constantine realized that Christianity was the wave of the future, was growing in popularity, and he wanted to be on the winning side, so he became a Christian. But before we start having warm and fuzzy feelings about Constantine, we should point out that he's not exactly the best example of Christianity. He did not get baptized until he was dying, literally laying on his deathbed, and he continued to persecute and murder people just like Caligula and Nero had done. One of his victims actually was his own son, who Constantine accused of plotting against him. Nevertheless, in 313, Constantine issued what was known as the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity, and told the Christians throughout the Roman Empire that they no longer had to fear persecution. They would not be thrown into the Colosseum to be torn apart by lions or used as street lamps at night. Instead, they were now a protected group. Skipping ahead a little bit, the last emperor that I'm going to tell you about in our study of Rome is Theodosius the Great, who reigned from 379 to 395. And his real significance is that in 380, he took Christianity, which was legalized, and made it the official state religion of the Roman Empire. So at this point, in 380 AD, Romans no longer can choose religion for themselves. Christianity is forced on them. It is the official state religion, and people have to be Christian whether they wanted to or not. What many historians point out is that it's ironic that Christianity is legalized, made the official religion in 380, legalized in 313, official religion in 380, and in less than 100 years the Roman Empire will cease to exist. Many historians say that Christianity definitely played a role in the end of the Roman Empire. So what we'll talk about next is the fall of the Roman Empire. 2 dates to note here. The Roman Empire collapses in 476 AD. Or at least one part of it does, and that is the western half from the old traditional capital of Rome. Since all of the resources had been going east since Diocletian moved there in 293 AD, the western half had grown weaker and weaker and was in a state of decline. In 476 AD, the western half of the Roman Empire fell. The eastern half would continue until 1453 AD. So for nearly another 1,000 years, the eastern half of the Roman Empire continues. But its name changes after 476. The eastern half is no longer known as the eastern half of the Roman Empire. It is then called the Byzantine Empire. So the 476 date is the fall of the western half. The eastern half continues until 1453 AD, and if you think about it, that means that the Roman Empire's only been gone off the face of the earth for about 600 years. So what we're going to talk about next is why did Rome fall in 476 AD? Why did the western half cease to exist in 476 AD? Well, many historians have attempted to answer that question over the years, but the one who's done the best job is a British historian by the name of Edward Gibbon, who in 1776 published a work which is very long, just like its title, called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Edward Gibbon wrote a multi-volume set of books entitled The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776. This work, which takes up about a foot on your average library bookshelf, was the culmination of Edward Gibbon's lifetime of research. He had dedicated his entire adult life to studying the Roman Empire, in particular its collapse. And in 1776, Edward Gibbon described the different reasons for the collapse of the Roman Empire. And in this work that is literally thousands of pages long, Edward Gibbon lists about 7 reasons for Rome's decline. But before I get to that, I'll tell you that his thesis was basically this. He said what we should ask is not why Western Rome fell in 476, but really why it was able to last as long as it did when it had as many problems as it did. So what are these problems? What led to Rome's fall? Well, according to Edward Gibbon, the main reasons for the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire in 476 AD were barbarian invasions, Christianity, lead poisoning, plague, an unstable political system, dependence on slave labor rather than technology, and a decline of traditional Roman values, which is tied to Christianity. Now, of these causes, I'm really only going to focus on 2 here in my discussion with you, so if you want to know more specific information about the others, you can refer to chapters 5, 6, and 7 in your textbook. So, here we go. One of the reasons that Edward Gibbon describes for the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire in 476 AD was barbarian invasions. I need to point out, first of all, what is meant by the word barbarian. The Romans got this word, barbarian, from the Greeks. The Greeks described anyone who was not Greek. Now, the Romans describe anyone who's not Roman or not Greek as barbarian. That means non-Roman, non-citizen. The word barbarian actually comes from what the Greeks and Romans thought other people sounded like when they spoke. To the Greeks and the Romans, who had a very soft-sounding language, Greek and Latin are very soothing-sounding languages when you listened to them, they thought that other people sounded like they were saying bar, bar, bar when they talked, so they referred to anyone who did not speak Greek or Latin, anyone who was not Greek or Roman, as barbarian. These included people like the Goths, the Franks, the Saxons, the Alemanni, who started to invade Rome as early as 258 AD. Also refers to Attila and the Huns, who invaded in 452, the Vandals in 455, and the Germans in 476. So with each of these invasions, the Goths, Franks, Saxons, and Alemanni in 258, Attila and the Huns in 452, the Vandals in 455, each of these invasions into Rome itself, the capital city, was characterized by pillaging, raping, murdering, vandalism, burning parts of the city, etc., etc. And with each of these successive invasions, it took Rome, the city of Rome, longer and longer to rebuild and recover from the damage, so that by the time of 476 AD, when the Germans invade, Rome really cannot withstand another invasion. So in 476 AD, the Germans invade Rome. They do the same thing that the Gauls, Franks, Saxons, Alemanni, Huns, and Vandals had done before them, but they take it a step farther. Not only do they rape, pillage, steal, murder, vandalize, they also physically, literally, take over the city of Rome itself. In 476 AD, when the Germans invade Rome, they find, sitting on the throne of Rome, the emperor, Romulus Augustus, who just happened to be in Rome, because remember, since 284, the Roman emperors had been over in Constantinople, as it came to be called. So Romulus Augustus happens to be in Rome in 476 AD when the Germans invade. They find him on the throne of Rome, depose him, in other words, take him off the throne, and place on the throne one of their own tribal leaders, a man named Odoacer. So in 476 AD, which is the official date for the fall of Western Rome, the Germans invade and take over the city of Rome. What they have done that other barbarian groups had not is that they actually deposed the Roman emperor and took over. We had a non-Roman in control of Rome. That is considered to be the official date for the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire. A second reason that Edward Gibbon discusses in his lengthy book is Christianity. What he has to say about Christianity is that it led to a decline in traditional Roman values. Until Christianity came along, Romans worshipped their leaders as gods on earth. They respected the government. They put their loyalty with the government and with the Roman system, even if they didn't agree with or particularly like their leaders. They still supported their government. What Christianity called people to do, as it spread to Rome, was to put their loyalty first with God, with Jesus, and with the church, rather than with the state. So how does Christianity begin? Well, we have to talk about the situation in Judea to begin with. The Romans took over Judea, issued extremely high taxes on the Jews, or so the Jews thought. The taxes that the Jews paid were actually not any higher than any other Roman citizens, but they didn't like paying taxes. They also did not like the fact that once Judea had become a part of the Roman Empire, the Romans put temples all over Judea dedicated to the Greek or Olympian gods, and they tried to force polytheism on the Jews, which they can't do because they're monotheists. So, born into this situation was a man named Jesus of Nazareth in Galilee. Jesus was born into a particularly turbulent time Basically, he's born into a situation that's pretty bad in Judea. There were plenty of Jews who were calling for a full-scale war and rebellion against the Romans to try to drive them out, refuse to pay taxes, etc., etc. And there were actually some Jews who felt that the end of the world was near, and they started talking about prophecies, long ago prophecies of someone called a Messiah who would come to save them from these terrible times. For some of the Jews living in Judea, they thought that the Messiah quite possibly was a teacher, preacher, and that means preacher of Jewish teachings. Jesus was a Jew. A carpenter, a teacher, a preacher by the name of Jesus. Jesus, who was born, traditionally we say, in 1 A.D., we now say was born in 3 B.C. Maybe we didn't put his date back far enough. 3 B.C. to AD 29. Jesus was born into this situation. And what he did was he tried to preach a message of peace to the Jews. And actually, if you look in the New Testament, you'll see that he was quoted as saying that the Jews should render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. What Jesus preached was basically Jewish teachings, but he put a message of peace and sort of can't we all get along sort of thing into his messages. And what he tried to tell the Jews was just to give to the Romans the taxes that they were asking for. Try to get along with them. Don't riot and rebel against them, because as Jesus said, this was not the kingdom that the Jews needed to worry about or think about, but that their reward would be in the next life. So this guy who preached a message of peace and understanding grew in popularity, and wherever he would go to deliver his messages, large crowds would gather. This came to the attention of the Roman prefect or governor, a man named Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate saw Jesus as public enemy number one because he had large crowds following him wherever he went, and Pontius Pilate was afraid that this Jew, Jesus, would lead the zealots, those are the Jews who are opposed to the Romans, against him. So he started checking into this situation, trying to figure out who Jesus was. Didn't basically care what his message was, just saw a huge crowd gathered around him and decided that it would be in his, Pontius Pilate's, best interests to get rid of this Jew. So Pontius Pilate has Jesus crucified. And then here's where you have to be careful, because history and faith sort of divide here. What faith says is that 3 days after Jesus' crucifixion, he was resurrected. And as news spread of that, the Jews who had followed Jesus believed that he had been resurrected, that he was the Son of God, that he was the Messiah that had been prophesied about. And these Jews came to be known as Christians, and they set out to teach the words of Jesus throughout the Roman Empire to win converts. So these Jews broke away from the other Jews and called themselves Christians. Christianity was spread thanks to a man named Paul, who lived from 5 A.D. until 67 A.D. when he was beheaded for trying to spread Christianity. So Paul's claim to fame is that he spread Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. He was not afraid to travel. He was bilingual, spoke multiple languages, and actually traveled throughout the Roman Empire winning converts to Christianity. And the reason why Edward Gibbon and other historians say that Christianity was dangerous to the Roman Empire, as I said before, was because it undermined traditional Roman values of support of the government. People began to place their loyalty with this new church rather than with the state. Last couple of things I'm going to talk with you here about is just a little information about Roman culture and Roman contributions. What I'm going to just share with you here is that a little information about Roman culture in basically 3 areas. Roman culture was spread throughout the Roman Empire by the Roman legions. So wherever they conquered, they took with them Roman culture and gave that Roman culture or forced it on the people that they conquered. This Roman culture included the belief that the family should be headed by the adult male called the paterfamilias, and in the Roman Empire, the adult male head of the family, the father, had complete control over his household. It was up to him to decide how big the family should be. In other words, when it was necessary for he and his wife to limit their family size, or to force daughters to marry, or to force sons out of the household to set up their own households. So the family was controlled by the paterfamilias, who had, right by law, to kill his wife and children if he wanted to without punishment. Fortunately, divorce was very common in Rome, so a woman who feared that her husband did not like her and would want to exercise his legal right to kill her and her children could leave and get a divorce. We know that the Roman family, and by Roman family I'm talking about families who lived in the Roman Empire from the British Isles all the way over to Jordan, had many and varied religions and languages. But the most common religions, of course, were the Olympian gods. And then with Constantine in 313, Christianity was legalized. In 380, everyone had to be Christian. The languages were many and varied also, but included Latin, which was spoke by everybody in the Roman Empire. That was a language you had to know in order to participate in the Roman way of life, to trade, etc., etc. And Greek was spoken among the upper classes. Also want to just briefly mention to you that Rome, and we could, I guess, put this under the category of contributions, but Rome invented the welfare system. And in ancient Rome, welfare, which was designed to take care of the poor, included not only money, but also food, bread, and circuses or entertainment. So part of the welfare system in Rome was to provide free housing for the poor, to give them food, but also to give them entertainment to keep them from roaming the streets, pickpocketing, and being a nuisance and dangerous. So in this welfare system of Rome, the government provided that people could take baths at public baths. This was provided at government cost. They also provided to people throughout the Roman Empire the opportunity to have a coliseum in their town where they could watch gladiatorial combat and plays and naval battles, just like if they were in the city of Rome itself. They also created throughout the Roman Empire what was called a Circus Maximus, which would hold over 100,000 people. There were Circus Maximus in every single Roman town, and what one would watch there would be chariot racing. Now, off to the category of contributions of Romans to Western civilization. So these contributions included architecture. Romans were famous for arches, like Greeks were famous for columns. The Romans also built aqueducts, which you can take a look at an aqueduct and how an aqueduct works on the Blackboard course page. That's a way that the Romans engineered and designed to bring into every city throughout the Roman Empire a gallon of fresh water per day for every resident. They also invented roads, 250,000 miles of roads, toilets, but no toilet papers, baths or bathtubs, but no soap, and concrete. A second contribution would be Romance languages, Romance meaning from the Romans. So the Romans spoke Latin, which is only used today in scientific and medical fields. It's a dead language, but out of Latin, other languages developed, which is why they're all so similar. These languages are Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. We also today, when we're writing, if you're taking notes now, for example, when you're writing, you use the Roman alphabet. The letters that you are writing come from the Romans. We talked about before the Roman idea of law, that it should be flexible and contained in a single source, was an idea adopted by the founding fathers of this country. The single source, of course, would be the Constitution, and flexibility of the law would refer to basically the Supreme Court, who ultimately decides how flexible our laws can be. One of the other ideas that Rome gave to the Western world was the idea of a Senate. There again, you see that reflected in the United States system of government. We have a Senate. And if we're just going to stretch it here and say a couple of other things that the Romans contributed to the modern world, those would include things like hair dye and bleach, and also the use of condoms. And just briefly to mention this, there are many Latin phrases that we use in the world today. These include, and I'll just say them here, they're ones that you probably will recognize, the term status quo, alias, agenda, alma mater, alumni, e pluribus unum, which you can find as one of the mottos of our country. It means out of many, one. Facsimile or fax, if you've ever heard that. Magna and summa cum laude. Also, postmortem. Semper Fidelis, that's the motto of the Marine Corps. Subpoena, which we hope none of us ever get to subpoena for court. Via, and vice versa, just to name a few.